This workshop is going to be about music theory, and some of you may have come to the beginning music theory workshop. If you didn't, that's no problem, but all this is going to assume you have is a basic familiarity with what a scale is, what a mode is, and the kind of basic ways that we name notes in scales. If you don't know that, hopefully you'll still be able to get something out of it. The first 20 or so minutes, maybe 30 minutes, I'm going to spend talking about sort of the next logical subject from where we left off in the first workshop. We're going to cover chords and how we name chords and how we describe color notes that are added to chords and stuff like that. I'm going to talk a little bit about rhythm and swing, and we're going to talk a little bit about chord progressions maybe. That'll be like the first 20-30 minutes. So if you already know that stuff and you wanted to check out for a little while and come back later, then you can see where we're at after about that much time. Then my hope is to talk about application a little bit, how you use this stuff when you are actually trying to make music with people. If you want to go into speaker mode instead of gallery view, that might be useful because I'm going to be doing some graphical stuff on the screen, and if it's small, you may not be able to understand what it is. You might pin my video, that might be something that helps you out. And when you're in speaker view, you'll see that Zoom has a little floating window up in the corner with the other video images. That might get in your way. You can move it around if you want to. You can also shrink it with one of the buttons that it has to make it smaller. So that might be useful to you as well. Okay, I'm going to dive into it. I'm just looking over my notes real quick. You can hear this piano sound, right? Thumbs up? Okay, great. Okay, let's start. Where we left off in the first workshop was we had finished talking about scales and kind of had a framework for how we talk about notes and scales and such. We also talked about intervals. And we talked about intervals because they are an important part of how we name chords. So I'm going to go over intervals again real quick. This is kind of the fast version. How the terminology of intervals works. An interval is just a measurement of distance of pitch, okay? I'm going to pull up my wonderful visual aids here. These two gold notes here, these are representing the octave, okay? So here are two notes in an octave, and we said that we divided that octave up into 12 pieces. You can see that there are 12 little, oh, give me a second here. You can see that there are 12 little steps along the octave there. And we had a set of terms that intervals use that is based on the major scale, just like just about everything else in the terminology of music theory. So let me pull up the major scale. And I'm going to pull up the numbers that we used to describe the notes in the major scale. So we called this note the 1 and the 2 and the 3. These are all the notes in the major scale, right? The highlighted notes here, these brighter bars are representing the notes in the major scale. And the intervals that we had already learned, one was the octave, which was the entire distance between the two notes there. We learned an interval called a step, which is 2 of these notes. The interval of a half step was just one of those steps there. And we learned that the intervals are named according to their position in the major scale. So another name of this interval is a second. Another name for this interval is a third. This one's called a fourth, and so on. There's some special nomenclature in the world of intervals. We don't say sharp or flat when we're talking about intervals. So if this is a second, you can also call this interval a diminished second. There's a special terminology, major and minor, that applies to intervals. So this interval we called a third. But if we shrink that interval a little bit, we get an interval of what's called a minor third. My tablet button just stopped working, so bear with me for a second here. Some intervals, like here's a fifth, This interval, if we stretch it out to here, we call it an augmented fifth. And if we were to shrink it to here, we would call it a diminished fifth. So none of this is particularly profound. It's just like another set of terms that you have to learn when it comes to describing intervals. Augmented means to make it bigger, diminished means to make it smaller. Perfect means the interval is right where it is. So a fifth and a perfect fifth, those are the same thing. Similarly, a major interval, like a major third, is just a regular third, and then a minor third means to shrink it a little bit. Okay, so armed with that knowledge, now we can talk about how we made our chords. And this is where we left off last time. We said that we wanted to make chords that were using notes from the major scale. If you've got a melody that's in the major scale and you want to generate some chords to play with it, it stands to reason that you want to make chords that use notes from that same major scale. So what we did is we just picked a note in the major scale. We started with the one note, and we said that we're going to pick every other note in the scale for a total of 3 notes. So we start on this 1, we skip the 2, we play the 3rd, we skip the 4, and we played the 5. And this is how we made our first chord. This cluster of notes is just a convention. I mean, you can make chords using all kinds of different combinations of notes, but this was the convention we used. We gave it a label of the 1 chord. We used a Roman numeral 1. Again, just a naming convention. This is just a shorthand symbol that refers to this shape of notes in a chord. Okay? Now, the next thing we did was make a chord that we rooted at the 2 note. And we did the same process. We picked every other note. We had the 2 note, we had the 4 note, and the 6 note, right? And this generates another chord. We're going to give it a special name as well. It's the 2 chord, the Roman numeral 2. And we put a little M. And why did we do that? Oops, don't do that. Because this is what's called a minor chord, and its majorness or minorness is defined by this first interval. Let's look back for a second at our interval that we called a third. The third interval came, I'll draw it down here, it came from this 1 up to here. That's what we called a third. So let's count the number of half steps that are in the interval of a third. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 half steps in a major third interval. And there are 3 half steps in a minor third interval. So if we look at this chord and we want to sort of break down the anatomy of this chord, we can say, okay, there's 1, 2, 3 half steps in this first interval. This is a minor third interval right here. And that is the definition of a minor chord. It's got a minor third interval in the bottom, so it gets a little m for minor. Actually, the full definition also includes a 5th interval here. If you counted up the half steps, this is the same as a 5th. It has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 half steps. This is the 5th interval. It's the same distance if we measure from here up to the 5, right? That's the same distance. Okay, so we went like this through the entire scale. We did this in the last session here. And we generated a bunch of chords that we can use. We generated a chord based on the 3 note. It turned out to be minor. The 4 gave us a 4 chord. The 5. By the way, my handwriting is going to be awful this whole process because this tablet is difficult to draw on. So bear with me on that. These are the chords that we generated when we continue that process through the entire scale. We call this the harmonization of the major scale. In other words, we took our major scale notes, we applied this pattern, we went to every note in the scale using it as the root in turn. We picked every other note in the scale, and it generated these chord shapes. This one over here is called the diminished chord. This little circle here means it's a diminished chord. It's got a slightly different shape, and we're just not going to worry about it for now. In fact, in practice, the 7 diminished isn't even really used in contemporary music, so you kind of just don't have to worry about it. So this is a really useful thing to kind of put into your memory banks, the harmonization of the major scale. Again, the major scale isn't the only scale in the world. There are other scales, and if you use a different scale at the beginning and you harmonize it, you're going to get different chords. The patterns are going to work out differently. But in terms of putting music theory into practice and being able to actually apply it when you walk into a musical circle, this is something you want to remember because it's used a lot. the way you can remember it, the way I remember it at least, is that the 1, the 4, and the 5 are major chords, and the 2, 3, and everything else is minor, basically. The 2, the 3, and the 6 are minor. But I just remember the 1, 4, and 5. You've probably heard musicians talking about 1, 4, 5 songs. In fact, it's kind of a joke on the internet. There are videos demonstrating how if you know the 1, 4, and 5, you can play just about any pop song in the last 50 years. In fact, if you know the 1, 4, 5, and the 6 minor, you've really got solid coverage. Maybe 95% of the songs in the world use those 4 chords. So a good thing you can do is to start practicing applying this into absolute pitch names. And we did this in the first session, but let's do it again now. Let's remember that our absolute pitch labels, they don't move around on the line of pitch, right? They are anchored. They are anchored in a particular spot. I can slide the shape of the major scale around on the pitch line, but the absolute notes stay where they are. So let's say you want to figure out the chords in a particular key. Let's say you wanted to figure out all the chords you could use in the key of G, for example. Well, to do that, you just sort of slide your major scale shape so that the 1, the tonic of your scale, lines up with the G. And you can see that now the 1 is right here, and it's lined up with the G, right? So now this tells us what our scale, if we go by these highlighted notes here, this tells us that the notes in our G scale are G, A, B, C, D, E, F, F sharp, and G, right? But it also tells us what the chords are because we know this pattern. So the 1 chord is the chord that's based off of the 1 note, the G. So we know that that's a G chord. When you see a letter like this, you don't know if it's referring to the G chord or the G note. You just kind of have to get it from the context. In this case, we know it's a G chord. The chord that's based off of the 2 note, the 2 note is right here, and we know that that's an A chord, and we know that it's minor, because that's the pattern that we figured out already. So we know that the 2nd chord we can use as an A minor. 3rd note's a B, that gives us B minor. The 4 and the 5 are C and D, that's an E minor. And our good old forgotten child F sharp diminished that nobody ever plays. So G, A minor, C, D, and E minor. These are the chords you can use with the G major scale. Now, any of you that have ever played guitar and accompanied anybody have probably seen G, C, and D hanging out together. They're good friends in the musical world, right? And E minor is their best extra friend. Most musicians in practice, when they walk into a circle of musicians and people are playing, aren't working this all out in their head and doing the math and figuring out how many intervals and this and that. They're just remembering that G, C, and D like to hang out together. Hopefully, now that you know this pattern exists, you can start to kind of apply this knowledge when you start to see those patterns. You can say, okay, G's the 1, C's the 4, and D's the 5. Now I get it. So a useful thing to do, and we'll do this right now, is to write down the 1, 4, 5 in all the common keys. The 1, 4, 5, and we'll get the 6 minor as well. And all of you, regardless of your level of music theory knowledge, probably have a shot at guessing most of this on your own. If we're in C, the 1, 4, and 5 is C, F, G, and I'll put the 6 minor. If we're in the key of D, we get D, G, A, and B minor. If we're in E, get E, A, and B, C sharp minor. If we're in the key of, I'll do F, but before I do, let me show you a little trick here. This is kind of like memorizing your multiplication tables. When you're young and you're presented with it for the first time, it's intimidating, but it quickly becomes second nature. But you don't even really have to memorize it. You can just use the alphabet, because in the folk key, this trick doesn't always work, but I'll just show you this trick. You just count through the letters of the alphabet, C, D, E. So this is 1, 2, 3. Then the 4 is the F, right? And then the 5 is just going to be the next letter after that. D, E, F, G, and then A is the next letter after it. E, F, G, A, B is the next letter after it. Same thing with the 6, you just go one further letter, right? It works most of the time. In the folk keys, this will work great. But look what happens when we get to F. You might think, okay, F, G, A, B is the next one, right? Well, actually it's B flat. So it doesn't always work out perfectly, but it'll get you most of the way there. This was a C sharp minor, it wasn't C minor, so, you know, there's some exceptions. Here's G, C, D, and E minor, and the last one, A, D, E, and F sharp minor. These are the 1, 4, 5s in all the common folk keys, and once you know this, and you know which is the 1, which is the 4, and which is the 5, you won't have any more trouble when someone says, oh, let's play the song in A instead of G. If you've learned the song in G, and you know that the pattern is 1, 4, 1, 5, 1, 4, 1, 5, and so on, then when someone says go to A, it's no big deal. Now it's A, D, A, E, A, D, A, E instead, because you know the function of these chords. They call it the function. Should I say anything more about that? Let me look at my notes while I'm doing so. Celine will let me know if there's any questions on the floor here.
Casey, is the 1 the root then?
Yeah.
Or the tonic?
Yeah, the terminology is a little delicate. The 1, the Arabic numeral 1, refers to the note, which is the tonic of the scale. The Roman numeral 1 refers to the chord that is based off of the tonic of the scale. And then we have this other term, which is root. And the root refers to the root note of the chord. So let's look at our F chord. Let's say we're looking at this chord. We're in the key of C, and we're looking at the F chord, which is the 4 chord. The root of the F chord is F, just like the root of the A chord is A, the root of the B chord is B, root of the G chord is G, and so on. But the tonic of the scale that's in use in this key is going to be C. Does that clear it up? A lot of these terms kind of get used, they do double duty, you know, in this context they mean this, in that context they mean that, but it should be pretty clear from context, I think, right? Does that make sense?
That helps, thank you.
Sure. So one thing to notice here, let me erase some of this extraneous stuff here. One thing to notice is that these chords have different functions kind of depending on what key you're in. If you're in the key of D, then D is the 1, G is the 4, A is the 5, B minor is the 6 minor. If you're in the key of A, we see the D chord again. It's over here, right? In this case, the D chord is acting as the 4. So a chord's function sort of depends on what the context is. I've heard the metaphor before that I like a lot, which is that you can think of it as titles of nobility. You might be a duke in your king. You might be the king of your kingdom, but in the neighboring kingdom, you're a duke. And in the kingdom next to that, you're a prince or something. I don't know how royalty works, but my understanding is that these roles, you one person, can fill different roles. And this is the same kind of thing with these chords. They act differently in different keys. So, okay, that's the 1, 4, 5. Useful thing to have in your pocket, and the 6 minor as well. Let's get back to chords and color notes and such. Turn the absolute labels off here. So far, we've been talking about these chords. We've been using these very simple clusters of every other note, right? That was our 1 chord. There's our 2 minor chord. There's our 3 minor, our 4, our 5, and so forth. In the real musical world, chords don't always adhere to this very simple shape. They call that cluster the triad, these 3 notes together. Doesn't matter, it's just so you know. They don't always adhere to that shape. And the first thing to understand is what they call the voicing of a chord. The voicing of a chord is well, let me show you. We're using for this chord, this is the 1 chord if we're in the major scale. 1, 3, and 5 are the 3 notes. Now, I can take, I'm going to need a little more space, so let me just do this. Yeah, that should do it. I'm going to take this 3 note that's right here, right in the middle of the chord, and I'm going to reflect it up an octave. You'll remember that notes an octave apart from each other are basically the same note. So I'm going to play this note up here. Instead of the 3 down here, we'll do the 3 up here. Well, that sounds great, doesn't it? That's still a 1 chord. It's a different voicing of the 1 chord. The basic rule is that as long as you have some number of 1s, some number of 3s, and some number of 5s, wherever they are in whatever octave, you're basically still playing the same chord. But it does have a different sound. It has kind of a slightly different feel. Similarly, we could put the 5 note, instead of up here, I'll go down an octave. Oh, it's not showing up on the screen, and I don't have time to figure out why, so let me do something else. Yeah, there, we'll put it up here. We'll put the 3 here and the 5 here. Right, that's also a 1 chord. Voicing is one of those impressionistic musical things that makes a big difference on the feel of music. If you've ever picked up a piece of music, say you were going to strum it on the guitar and you've got the chord chart and you're excited to learn your favorite song, and it sounds right, but there's kind of something off, like there's something about the feel that doesn't quite work. Well, a lot of times the voicing can explain that. It's the way the chords are voiced. Different instruments lend themselves to different voicings of chords. On a piano, it's really easy to do certain voicings. On guitar, you might get a different set of voicings that come more naturally depending on how the fingering works out. So it's something to pay attention to and be sensitive to. The voicing, you might technically be playing the same chord, but the voicing is really different. It might not quite sound right. The other thing you can do to make chords a little more interesting is to add color notes to them. So instead of just using these 3 notes, we're going to add some notes to spice the chord up. Chords, you can have any number of notes in a chord. It doesn't just it could be 2 is the minimum number, but you could have 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 notes. You could have all kinds of notes in there. And we already saw the basic naming system of having a Roman numeral to indicate a major chord, and then we stuck a little M next to it to indicate that it's a minor shape. There's all kinds of other stuff you've probably seen, this like 4, flat 4, Aug 5, sus 2, blah, blah, blah stuff. So we're going to talk about a little bit of that. It's kind of a big and elaborate world, to be honest with you, and we won't have time to cover most of it, but I'll give you some of the basic stuff that you're likely to encounter, especially in folk music. So the first thing to understand is that, let's say we were modifying a 4 chord. You'll see these numbers associated with a chord. So let's say we got a 4-6 chord. When you say it out loud, 4-6 just sounds like I'm spewing numbers at you. When you see it written, it's a little clearer. The Roman numeral means it's a chord shape. This little Arabic numeral we add means this is the color note we're going to add to the 4 chord. So let's look at the 4 chord on the screen here. The 4 chord uses these notes. We did this before where we started with the 4 note and we skipped every other note. So we're using the 4, the 6, and the 1. Those are the 3 notes that are in the 4 chord. Now, this number 6, what it tells you is add a note to the chord that is the interval of a 6th from the root of the chord. So what that means is first we have to remember what a 6th interval is. A 6th interval was defined by the distance between the tonic of the chord and the 6th note. So here's the 6th note. This is a 6th interval. And a 6th interval is a 6th interval wherever it lies. If we slide over here, this is also a 6th. That 6th is just, it's like a yardstick. It's just a measurement of distance. Doesn't matter where it is in the scale or anything else. It's always a 6th. So that's a 6th, that's a 6th, and so on. Okay. Let me erase that real quick. Hold on. So we want to add a 6th interval. First, let's just count how many steps are involved in this 6th interval. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, I'm sorry, half steps. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 half steps, right? That's the distance of a 6th. It's 9 half steps. Let me erase it. Schwank. So here's our 4 chord, and we want to add the interval of a 6th based off this. So we start here and we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So we're going to add this note into the chord. And that is a 4-6 chord. That's kind of a smooth sound. It's used in jazz. You don't see it so much in folk music, but it's a good place to start with the terminology here. Now there's an easier way to know where the 6 is. We know that the basic shape of a major chord is comprised of a major third on the bottom and then a fifth as the wider interval, right? So if this is a fifth, we know that the sixth interval is just a whole step above that to the sixth. That's the faster way to figure it out, right? Okay. Again, as with the 1-4-5 stuff, most musicians don't do this stuff by working out the math in their head on the fly. They just kind of know, if they're a guitar player, they know where to put their finger to make a sixth chord, you know. Nothing wrong with that. And also, and I'm going to harp on this a lot today, using your ear is a really important way to do this stuff. Most of us can very quickly learn to tell the difference between a major chord and a minor chord. They have very different sounds, right? And once we've learned how that sounds, you don't have to be counting anymore. You can just recognize what you already know. So that's a sixth chord. This is where we're going to start to understand these numbers. The world of naming chords is fraught with little exceptions and gotchas and pitfalls and stuff, so don't get too frustrated by it. I'm going to show you one, the most famous pitfall here comes next. Let's say you want to play a 7 chord, a 4-7. Now based on what I just said, you would say, all right, there is the 4 chord. It's got those notes. I knew that this was the 6, was here. If I want to add the 7, again, all these names are coming from the shape of the major scale, so I know the 7's a whole step up from the 6. So I'm just going to go up here and I'm going to add the 7 note, right? That must be a 4-7 chord, right? Well, it turns out it's not. It's just a quirk of the naming that when you add a 7, what they call a 7 is actually a minor 7 interval. So instead of adding the natural 7 interval, what we're actually going to add is this one right here. We're adding a minor 7 interval. Doesn't really matter why, you just have to know that it's a quirk. If you wanted to actually add the natural 7 interval, you would have called that a major 7, a 4 major 7. That adds this note, which is the major 7 interval. There's the minor 7. So it's just a good example of how, chord naming can be a little confusing sometimes because there's some strange traditions. Major and minor chords are important. We've already talked about those. The 7 we just covered. You'll see this a lot. Let's see, what are some other chords that you're probably likely to run into? You know what, I'm just going to leave it to your questions. If you have questions about specific chord shapes, ask later when we're doing the Q&A stuff, and I'll explain how those shapes work. These are the ones you mainly need to know. I will talk about one other consideration. When we started this process of figuring out chords for a scale, we said we've got our scale shape. It's highlighted by the white notes there on the screen. And we wanted to pick chords that use only notes from that scale. So we did that process. We went through each scale note in turn and we developed a 3-note chord based on notes in the scale. Well, now we're in this business of adding color notes to these chords. And we've kind of forgotten that original rule. So let's look at, for example, let me start over on, let's say we're adding the 1, or we want to form the 1-7 chord. Well, we pick the normal triad, and now we're also going to add, here we've got the 1, 3, and the 5, and we want to add a minor 7 interval. Incidentally, a really easy way to find the 7 and the minor 7 and such is to remember that the 7 is just a half step under the next octave 1. So instead of thinking of the 7 as like the distance of a 7th up from the root, I just think of the 7 as a half step under the tonic. And the minor 7, which is what we want to add now, is just a half step under that. So to make a 7 chord, you're just adding a note that's a whole step under the tonic, right? So there's our 1-7 chord. Now what you'll notice is that this note is not in the major scale, right? If we played a major 7, it's in the scale. That minor 7 note is not in the major scale. Isn't that breaking the rule that we established before where we want to make chords that use only notes from the major scale? Yeah, it is. And that's an important lesson in music theory, is that these rules are broken all the time. 7 chords are super common, especially if you're playing the blues or anything like that. So if you're out there in the world and you're trying to apply this stuff and you think, well, wait a minute, that note's not in the scale, don't think, I must not have paid attention in class. Just understand that it might be that you made a mistake, but it's just as likely that some musician just decided to use that 7 note, even though it's not in the scale, just because they like the way it sounds. This stuff is all really useful if you're just talking about communication, you're talking about visualization, you're talking about remembering things. It's less useful, in my opinion, if you think of it as hard and fast rules that you have to follow. All right, I'm going to stop there with the chord naming. We're about a half hour in here. What I'm going to shift to next is a sort of walkthrough of actually applying this stuff when you approach a piece of music. Before I do that, though, I just want to take any questions or confusions that people have. If you have any questions about other chords that you've seen that you want, like if you want to know what a diminished chord is or a sus4 or anything like that, go ahead and ask those now, and we can talk about it. Or questions about anything else I've been talking about. I will give you 15 more seconds. Okay, hearing no questions, I will proceed.
There is one question.
Oh, there we go, great. Oh, it's in the chat. Okay, sorry.
It says, could you discuss
Sus chords.
sus?
Sure. If we take a chord, let's look at sus chords apply to major chords. Well, that's an oversimplification, but let's just look at a major chord. Let's look at the 4 chord. We understand that the 4 chord, like the anatomy of almost all the basic chords that we make from our major scale, it's got a 5th, that's a wider interval, it's got a 3rd, a major 3rd is the shorter interval here. A sus chord, this is a 4 chord that we're playing. If we want to play a 4 sus, or the more explicit name is sus4, sometimes they just leave the 4 off and just call it a sus chord. All that means is that we take this 3rd that's in the middle and we move it up a half step. Right? In this particular case, that happened to go outside of the major scale. No big deal. That's what a sus chord is. You can think the shorthand is just move the 3rd up a half step temporarily. They call it sus because there's a sense of suspension, like it wants to resolve back to the regular chord, in the opinion of the namer. If we look at the 1 chord, we do the same thing here. Here's our 3rd in the 1 chord, and we go up to the 4 and then back to the 3. That's the 1 sus, and this is the 1. That's all there is to that. It's kind of a it's used a lot. You'll encounter that a lot in folk music, for sure. Make sense? All right, I see some nods. Okay, so let's talk about application. This is kind of the reason we learn all this stuff, is because when we want to play music with people, we don't want to just learn this for the heck of it. We want to learn it because it'll make things easier for us. I showed you the 1, 4, 5s and all the common folk keys, and as a first step, I would recommend just learning that, committing to memory what the 1s, 4s, and 5s are and all those keys. It'll take you 5 minutes. It's powerful when you can start to look at the music that you're playing and start to identify what's happening in it. And you can memorize that a song is G, C, D, but if you don't know that the G is the 1, the C is the 4, and the D is the 5, you kind of have left out some of your awareness of what's going on with that music. So that would be a first step, as far as like the background stuff you should bring to this task. When you walk into a room and there's some people playing music, the first thing I would pay attention to is the difference between the straight or swung rhythm. And this is going to be a little bit of a weird tangent, but it's a PSA I like to give in these music theory workshops a lot, because there's a really shocking number of musicians that aren't aware of it. So just in case you're one of them, let me take you through it. I'm going to draw a little rhythmic. I'm going to draw a rhythmic cycle on the screen here, okay? This isn't going to be quite perfectly aligned, but you'll get the idea. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and So what this is indicating is a rhythmic cycle. We've got like 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and then this little dotted line is where we loop back to the beginning of the cycle, right? So it's like 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. This rhythm is representing straight rhythm. It's a very even grid. This distance is the same as this distance, is the same, or I should say time, is the same as this time, is the same as this time, and this time, and this time. Everything's nice and even. And if you listen to a melody like this, it sounds like, I'll just go. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1, right? When you swing, they sometimes call this shuffle. It's the same idea. You take these intermediate beats here, and you're going to shift them in time this direction. You're going to leave these beats where they were, but you're going to shift these intermediate beats, and you get something that looks more like this. Right? So now you've got 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 1. And that would sound like. So this is swinging and this is straight. And then swinging and straight. It's kind of a skipping, lilting feel. They use this in all kinds of music, in folk music, classical, traditional Irish music, old-time music. This is all over the place. But the sensitivity you want to develop here is that not all swung rhythm or shuffle rhythm is the same amount of swing or degree of swing. And this is one of those delicate nuances of music that can really make the difference between an imposter playing a genre versus somebody who's really steeped in the tradition. A fully swung piece breaks this basically up into 3, my drawing is awful here, but pretend that these are 3 even segments of time, and we've gone from the original middle position all the way to this triplet location, okay? That would be like fully swung. You can go even further than that if you want. But a lot of times it's kind of in between the halfway point in this thing. The beat is actually happening somewhere in the middle. So I'm saying all this because when you walk up to a circle of musicians and they're playing, the first thing you want to understand is what's the rhythmic kind of framework? Is it swinging or is it straight? Pay attention to that and pay attention to the degree of swing or shuffle that's happening. The next thing in terms of the music theory that we've been talking about for the last couple of days that you want to pay attention to is what is the scale? What is the scale in use and what is the root of the scale? That's kind of the first question that you ask. How do you figure that out? It's not... There is no easy, automatic, mindless way that you can figure out what the scale is and where the root is. In fact, sometimes it's not even entirely clear. It can be kind of ambiguous sometimes. Most of the time, there is a scale in use. Most of the time, it has a clear tonic. So how do you figure it out? Well, it's a combination of pattern recognition. It's a combination of sleuthing and using little clues. But to say it again, using your ear is really the most powerful technique you can rely on. And it's really the direction you should lean in as you're learning this stuff. Learn all the names and the terminology and stuff, but don't forget that your ear is right there telling you the answer sometimes. And if you just listen to it, you can get there a lot faster. So let's say you walk up and I am playing a melody like this. This is a little tune I wrote. Whoops. The first question you might ask is this a major scale or a minor scale? That's something that you can tell by ear a lot with some practice. The very first question you might ask is this straight or swung rhythm? And we just went through our exercise before. Hopefully you can tell that this has a swing to it. If it was straight, it would have sounded like... right? But it's swung, so it goes... It's got that skip to it. Okay, so we have maybe a guess that it's in a major scale. We're not really sure yet, and we know that it's swung. How do you start to get specific about the scale? Well, our major scale, if you look on the screen again here, you will see that it's got this pattern that hopefully you're familiar with by now. It's got this pattern of whole steps, and then we've got a little half step, and then it's got more whole steps, and then it's got a little half step at the end, right? Well, these half steps, these little clusters here, oops, that's not the right place. These can act as sort of a fingerprint or a signature of the scale. Most scales, and again, this is a generalization, but most scales are comprised of whole steps and half steps. You don't see a lot of scales where they have 3 notes in a row like that. Usually it'll be at least a whole step. Sometimes you even have wider gaps than that in scales. So if you look for these little half step locations, they can give you a strong clue as to where the tonic might be, what scale might be in play. The more familiar you are with the major scale shape, of course, the more easily you can recognize it when you start to figure things out. But what I would do when I walk up upon somebody playing that melody is I would start to try to play it myself on my own instrument. And that gets me a visualization that says, okay, now I know where some of these half steps are, I know where the whole steps are. If I see a half step pairing, if I see 2 notes together, I know that it's either the 3 and the 4 or the 7 and the 1. If we're talking about the major scale. Might not be the major scale, but the major scale is a good first guess, especially in folk music. So at the beginning of this melody, we heard, let me turn off our hints here so you don't get the advantage. I'm going to change the key too, if I can. Right, the first 3 notes were this. Oh, I'm still giving you the clues. Didn't mean to do that. Hold on. There we go. So now it's just notes floating in space, just like you would hear them when you walked in, right? Right? They're just jumping around, but if you work them out on your instrument, you can say, okay, I heard this. These 3 notes, and then it went like this. Oh, look at that. We've got these half steps here, right? So I know that this is either the 3 and the 4 or the 7 and the 1, if we're using the major scale. And we're not always using the major scale, but I'm already halfway there. Now all I have to do is say, okay, well, if that's the 3 and the 4, that makes this the 1, and then I can kind of do the detective work and go from there to figure out the scale. Again, using your ear is usually a lot more efficient, a lot faster of a method, but when you're starting out, sometimes it's useful to kind of really break it down and figure out what the scale is. So you use patterns like that. The other thing you can keep an eye out for are runs of notes. Sometimes melodies just jump all over the place in the scale. And, you know, the melody might be like, and it's kind of hard to keep a hold of. But sometimes melodies do little runs down a scale. This melody started with a very short run, right? That's 3 notes in a row. These in between notes, they might be in the scale, but we skipped them, and it's kind of a good chance that they're not. Some melodies do this in a really obvious way. I used the example in the last talk of Joy to the World. It's sort of the classic example of this. The melody begins, it just walks down the entire major scale from the tonic to the tonic, right? It gives it away immediately. Very hard to argue that this is in the major scale and these are our tonics, right? It just told you all the notes. So sometimes you'll get that. You'll get a little run. 3 turtle doves, 2 French hens, or whatever. Right? That just gave us a little walk, and with a little practice you can learn to recognize that as a walk down from the 5 to the 1 in the major scale. So again, no easy shortcuts, but this is the kind of work you can start to do to try to decipher what's happening with the scale. Now, it may not be the major scale, as we've discussed, so if it's not, you do the same kind of procedure, but you figure out what notes are in the scale. You can write them down if it helps to do that. You can start trying to play the scale. You know, you learn the melody, and once you've learned the melody, you try to change into the scale that's under that melody and see if it sounds right. And then once you've got this cluster of notes that you're calling the scale, well, then you can start doing the fun stuff. You can start generating the chords that would go with it. You can harmonize that scale like we did with the major scale, and that can tell you some chords that might be useful in it. We can go through that exercise if you'd like. I'm going to skip it for now, but I'd be happy to do it if you wanted to. So you've determined whether it's straight or swung rhythm. You've determined the key it's in, the major scale, and you've determined the scale it's using, might be the major scale, and you've figured out the key and so forth. So if you are approaching someone who's just playing a melody, then you might say, all right, I want to play some chords with this melody. And that's a big discussion. I actually have some videos on YouTube. If you want to Google me, or you search me on YouTube, Casey Connor and Music Theory. I've got videos on how to choose chords for a melody, how to write a melody in general. And it goes into a little bit more depth in like how you determine the scale that's in use and that kind of thing. But we already have talked about the harmonization of the major scale. So if it's a major scale melody, you already have a set of chords, the 1, the 4, the 5, the 6 minor, 2 and the 3 minor, and so forth, that you can start to pull out of your bag of tricks to play along with that melody. So in this case, let's say, I'm going to turn our hints back on here. Octaves and scale major. So if we're doing this, if that's our melody that we're working with, I've got this set of chords. I know this happens to, well, let's call it 1. This is the major scale. Let's get explicit. I'll turn the absolute note names on here. This is F. Right? We've figured out that we're using the F major scale. So, since I know the harmonization of the major scale, I already know the chords that are in the F major scale. I get F, G minor, A minor, B is the 4, C is the 5, and D is the 6 minor. D minor is the 6 minor. So I can just start trying those chords at random. And honestly, chord progressions are kind of just up to you. There's no real rules about that. Music theory gets pretty loose when you get into the world of chord progressions. But now you know 1, 4, 5, F, B flat, and C, and I know the 6 minor is D minor. You know, if you have those to hand, now you can just start busting out chords and seeing what works and changing things around and talking with the other musician and figuring out what you like. So I want to talk about one other kind of gotcha you might run into when it comes to this, and that's the pentatonic scales. Pentatonic scales are super common in the world of folk music. I should, if I'd thought ahead, I would have come up with a indication of the pentatonic scale in my little program here, but I didn't, so I'm going to do it this way. Our major scale looked like this, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1. To generate a pentatonic scale, specifically the major pentatonic scale, all you do is you take out a couple of these notes. You just lower the number of notes that you're actually going to play. This 4 note goes away, and this 7 note goes away. So now we have what's called a pentatonic. Penta because there are 5 notes in it. That's the pentatonic scale. You've heard this scale if you've ever heard wind chimes. A lot of sort of very simple instruments might only have pentatonic scale notes. The black keys on the piano are a major pentatonic scale, for example. You might be familiar with the old cliche that you can just mash on the black keys on the piano and it always sounds good no matter what you do. The pentatonic scale is very forgiving in that way. It's also kind of the anchor of a lot of folk music. You'll hear a lot of pentatonic melodies. Amazing Grace is largely in the pentatonic scale, for example. That would be... That's all pentatonic notes. The reason I bring it up is because the pentatonic scale might confuse you if you're trying to figure out what the scale is. If you're trying to work out a pentatonic melody, you're never going to see the 4. You're never going to see the 7. But the chords that you are going to use are the same chords that you would get from the major scale, the full major scale. And in that sense, you can think of the pentatonic scale as basically being the major scale. It's just kind of not emphasizing a couple of the notes that are in it. So I mention that because it might throw you off a little bit if you're picking out some melodies on your own. There's a minor pentatonic scale as well. We talked yesterday about the natural minor scale, which is this shape, right? It's the 1, the 2, the flat third, the 4, the 5, flat 6, and flat 7. And the minor pentatonic does the same thing in that it takes out a couple of notes. It takes out the 2, and it takes out the sharp or the flat 6 here, right? So it sounds like this. Again, wind chimes come to mind. It's a very soothing scale. used a lot in the blues, used a lot in all kinds of music. And same kind of rules apply. You know, if you're trying to figure out the chords that you might use with the minor pentatonic scale, you treat it like a you treat it like a full natural minor scale. Okay, we have about 10 minutes left. So, you know, I could ramble on about any number of aspects here, but what kind of things would you guys like to hear more about, or do you have questions outstanding about the stuff I've already talked about? Oh, I see the chat. I need to pay more attention to the chat. Oh, my link. Thank you, Celine. We could talk more about describing chords. We could talk more about chord progressions and common things you might see. We could talk about other scales that you might encounter or be interesting. Any of those subjects sound interesting?
Maybe we could do something with minor keys.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I see chord progressions and chord progressions. So why don't we talk about chord progressions in minor keys? Chord progressions are kind of an interesting subject because, as I mentioned, it's a very loose. The rules are very loose, and yet there are traditions. There are patterns and things that you hear a lot. One way to think about chord progressions is starting at the kind of 1-4-5 framework that we were doing before, right? Songs will very often start on a 1 chord and then they will end on a 1 chord. That's not a guarantee, but sorry, it's a little distraction. That's not a guarantee, but it's a pretty common pattern. So we have I'm just gonna write a chord progression. Say this is a measure of time. Here's a 1 chord. What's the next chord that should come after the 1? Honestly, you could do any of them. If we're working with the standard harmonization of the major scale, 3 minor, 4, 5, 6 minor. You could pick any one at random. You could go to the 2 minor. That sounds like this. Here's our 1. There's our 2 minor, right? You could then go to the 4 chord. You could go back to the 1. I'm just picking these at random. Then you could go to a 5 chord. Then you could go to a 6 minor. This is a great exercise to go through, to just choose them, figure out what they are in a particular key. So this is F, G minor, A minor, B flat, and so forth. Figure out what they are in a particular key and just play random chord progressions. Here's 1, 2 minor, 4, 1, 5, 6 minor, right? They'll sound nice. It's kind of the magic of chord progressions. But there are some movements that you'll see that are very common, and one that is a very powerful relationship is the 5 to the 1. In sort of classical Western music theory, they say that the 5 really wants to resolve to the 1. It's got like a strong pull to it. It's kind of it's like the end of a lot of classical music where it goes. Right? This is 1, 5, 1. And similarly, you'll see a lot of movement between the 1 and the 4. You'll see like a 1, 4, and a 1. They have a strong relationship with each other as well. This is they call this the Amen ending, because at the end of a lot of gospel music, you know, you'll have some melody. That right there is 4 to 1. So the good news is you don't really have to worry too much about chord progressions. You can just kind of feel them out for yourself and do what sounds good to you. It is useful, again, if you come across a piece of music, it is useful to start trying to understand, what the functional role of these chords is. If I come across a piece of music that looks like this, and it sounds like, just a bunch of chords. But if I know enough music theory, I can figure out that this is the 1, this is the 5, this is the 4, and so on. And you'll start to get a feel for what those things sound like, right? So let's look at minor chords, because there's some interesting things that happen in the world of minor chord progressions that can be a little confusing to beginners. First of all, let's refresh ourselves as to what a minor scale even is. As with chords, the minorness of a chord depends on the location of this third, right? If we said if there's a major third interval here, then it's a major chord, and if we make it here, then it's a minor chord. Scales were the same way. If they had a flat 3 in them, then we said that they were a minor scale. So here's the natural minor scale. It's got that flat 3 in it. So if we work out the harmonization for this minor scale, it looks a little different from the, here's a 2, sorry, 2 diminished. This is so messy. All right, 3, 4 minor, 5 minor, 7, right, 6, and making sure I'm getting this right, and then 7. Nope. Yeah, 7, okay. So that's the harmonization of the natural minor scale. Whoops. So you might think, okay, great, I'll just start throwing out some chords just like I normally do. Here's a 1 minor, here's a 4 minor, and so on. But a lot of times what you'll come across is when they hit the 5 chord, it should be a 5 minor, right? That's what we use in the harmonization. But a lot of times what you will see is just a 5 chord. Or you'll see even like a 5-7 chord is a really common alteration that you'll see in that. And so that sounds like this. First I'll play this 5 minor here. It sounds like this. Here's the 1 minor, 4 minor, and then the 5 minor, right? I'll do that again. 1 minor, 4 minor, 5 minor. Now I'm going to switch to the sometimes more common major chord, the 5-7. Right? And that kind of thing is one of those things that might throw you off a little bit if you're a beginner and be like, wait, I thought that was supposed to be a minor, the harmonization, I'm confused. It just happens sometimes, and there are interesting reasons why. You can think of chords, let's think of it this way. Let me get this off the screen. This is a tangent I should go on. I think I'm going to skip that tangent for now. I was going to go off on another little rabbit hole, but I'll just leave it at that. Chord progressions, it's sort of like determining the scale that's in use. There's not like an easy shortcut way to talk about it or explain how to come up with them or whatever. It really is something you should feel free and playful to explore on your own. And again, the more you can look at a piece of music you like and understand it, understand what the scale is, understand what the function of each of those chords is. Is it the 1 chord? Is it the 2 minor? Is it the 2 major? What kind of chord is this? Then you'll start to see patterns. You'll say, oh, I like the sound when we go from a 1 to a 5 to a 6 minor, right, to the 4. That's kind of a classic doo-wop pattern. Oops, 1, 5, 6, 4. Now you know what it is, right? Now you can look at it and say, oh, okay, I understand what the function of those chords are in that cycle. So you can use it in your own thing, or you can recognize it and have a name for it the next time you encounter it in a different song. And you can understand why you like it, and you can kind of get deeper into what all those notes are doing. So that's all I have. We're at 12:45, so if anyone wants to leave or whatever, feel free. I'm also happy to stick around and answer more questions if anybody wants to talk more about it. Oh, wondering if you can also review finding the 7th. Is it minor or major, but it's a step down from 8? I'm going to answer that question, but I won't be offended if other people leave because the hour's up. Okay, Alice asks about finding the 7th. Is it minor or major? You're welcome, everyone. Thanks. So Alice, if you're there, could you chime in and tell me, are you talking about finding the seventh when we're describing a chord, or are you talking about finding the seventh in a scale? Or should I explain the difference? Oh, I think you're muted, Alice. Oh, it doesn't say you're muted, but I can't hear you. Maybe you could just type into the chat whatever the answer was. Okay, let me pull up the good old visualization here. When we are talking about a scale, I'll go back to the major scale. We're talking about a scale. We've numbered the notes in the scale 1 through 7. Right? So we know that these notes all have a name, and the seventh note in the scale has the name the seventh. And then we've got a flat 7 or a sharp 6 note that we don't use in the scale. It's living here, right? So that's a naming system that we use to describe notes in the scale. Our scale may not have a 7 in it. When we looked at the natural minor scale, it had a flat 7 note in it. It's got no 7. It's just got a flat 7 in it, right? So in the world of scales, it's pretty straightforward. If you know where the tonic is, if there's a note that's just a half step under it that's used in the melody, then that means that you've got a natural 7 note. You've got just a regular old 7 in your scale. And if you've got a note that's a whole step under the tonic, like this, that means you've got a flat 7 in the scale. In this case, we've got the natural 7 shown on the screen, but a scale might just use this one instead. Or it might use both in very rare cases, but usually just one. When we were talking about chords, so if we were talking about, let's say, a C7 chord, oops, we've got a C7 chord. That's telling us something a little different. That says, make a C chord using the kind of standard shape of notes that we're familiar with. And then add a color note that is an interval, not the note, but an interval of a seventh off of the root of the chord. So let's get back into the abstract world here. I'm going to pretend I'm playing a 4 chord. So if I'm playing what's called a 4 chord, that means that standard cluster of notes based off of the 4 note. So here's our standard cluster of notes. We've got the root of the chord here, and we go up an interval of a third, an interval of a fifth. Now we've got our standard 4 chord. Now if we want to make this a 7 chord, that means we're adding an interval of a seventh off of the root of the chord. The root of the chord is the 4 note, and we want to add an interval of a seventh. But because of the weird nomenclature of chords, it's not actually the interval of a seventh. It's the interval of a seventh minus a half step. That's just the way the naming convention works. So how do we figure out that interval? Well, here's our 4 down here. We've got another 4 up an octave. And we know that the interval of a seventh, of a regular seventh, the interval is just 1 shy of an octave, right? So here's the octave, so we know that the regular 7th interval is right here, a half step under it. And then we know that what this is telling us is to add a note that's actually a half step shy of that. So that means we want to add this note here, which is that note, which I can't play on this keyboard. Oh wait, yes I can. There it is right there. And the kind of shorter hand way you can think of a 7 chord, anytime, like say you were told to play a 2-7 chord. Let's do a different one. Let's do the 1-7 chord. The shortest shortcut here is to say, okay, just find the tonic and then go a whole step under it to play that 7th. So here's our 1 chord, and here's our tonic of that, here's the root of the chord, I should say. And we want to play a note that is a whole step underneath it. So that's going to come down to here, which means to add that note, which is not in the major scale. That's fine. We don't care about scales when we're naming chords. They just tell us what note to add. And you asked, is it major or minor? And so you can have, let's look at a, whoa, what's happened there? Let's look at a 1-7 versus a 1 minor 7. The short answer is that the 7 is not major or minor per se. There's a bit of a, it's another one of these cases where a name is reused in music theory and it can be confusing because there's one context or another. If you're talking about a scale being major or minor, then you want to know whether or not that third is in its normal position or it's in a flattened position. If you're talking about whether a chord is major or minor, it's similar. It's in its normal position or it's in its flattened position for that third. If you're talking about an interval, they can be major or minor as well. So the interval of a third, this is the major third, and that's the minor third. Well, we also have a seventh. This would be a major seventh interval, and this would be a minor seventh interval. So as we've covered, this chord symbol, this 1-7, means to add a minor seventh interval off of the root of that chord. But it doesn't speak to whether or not the chord itself is major or minor. That depends on this third interval, right? So you can add a major 7 interval to this chord, or you can add a minor 7 interval to it, but the chord itself is just major. Unless we say that the chord's a minor chord with this little M. That means we take our third, we bring that down a half step. Now I'm playing a 1 minor chord, and I can add either a major 7th interval or a minor 7th interval to it. In this chord name, we've got a 7 here, so that means to add a minor 7th interval to it. So this is the minor 7 chord. Really classic chord shape that you'll hear a lot. Does that clear it up? It's one of those things where they use the term 3 different ways in 3 different places, and it can get a little confusing, but hopefully that makes it a little obvious. So it's always a whole step down from 8 or 1. Yeah, that is the major 7 interval. Is always a, oh, sorry, you're right. The minor 7 interval is always a whole step down from the 8 or the 1, exactly. The major 7 is a half step down. And that's the way I think of it. If I want to play a G7, I know that I just go up to a G and I go down a whole step, which is F. So I'm going to add an F to a G chord to make a G7 chord, for example. All right. Well, you bet, Alice. Thanks for sticking around for the bonus material. And I meant to say it during the group, but I'm doing like an open Q&A of music theory tomorrow at 3:30. So if you had more questions or you wanted to review some stuff or whatever, feel free to come to that and ask some more questions. Okay, bye.